Whatever we do, when we work, we're going to connect with organizations or be within organizations, so to speak. A communication-centered perspective on organizations and organizing can be very powerful in as much as it's unique. Most of us will try to think about the problems that face us in whatever profession or field we're working. So we're busy being architects or doing nursing and healthcare or engineering or marketing, developing advertisements for an ad firm, and on and on and on. But all of these actions, all of these objectives, all of these projects require communication, even if their outcome, the goals that we're seeking, are not primarily communicative, so to speak. Organizational communication isn't just about making organizations work better at what they do, though that's a really important function of being an organizational communication expert. No, instead, it's also the case that we can learn to communicate more wisely when we're cooperating with others to pursue common goals. Thinking critically about the kinds of problems we face in achieving our goals, but thinking critically about those goals and the processes we're using themselves. Let's talk a little bit more about research on organizational communication in the field of communication studies. Courses in the organizational communication concentration for the communication studies program develop three kinds of expertise. The first is leadership, the ability to motivate and move forward groups and teams of people. Second, organizational development is a skill area that's addressed in courses like organizational identity or communication in the trainer. These kinds of courses look at the ways in which organizations and their dynamics alter over time and how individuals and groups of people can leverage those dynamics for strategic change. The third area of expertise that organizational communication courses emphasize is collaboration. Skills related to working together and hosting conversations with others that are productive, whatever that might mean in context. We are very lucky to have Dr. Eric James here on campus at MSU Denver. Dr. James is exceptionally well published for someone at this point in his career. He works alongside me as well as Dr. Karen Lawler and Devika Banerjee and Dan Lair in teaching courses related to organizational communication. Dr. James is an expert in particular in workplace health promotion, as well as employee identity and occupational identity. That is, who we think we are when we engage in work within and across organizations. If interested, I encourage you to go to Google Scholar to look up Dr. James's extensive research on subjects in this area. So what does this course's watchword or key term, social construction, have to do with organizational communication? Well, first, we have to start with the idea that organizations are constituted, they are created in and through communication processes and relationships. They are not just containers in which we communicate, they're made up of communication itself. In this way, it's helpful to think in terms like organizing, verbs, gerunds, the ing words, as much as it is organizations, which is a noun, a thing. Look at the organizing processes that make up organizations, and you're beginning to think in a social construction framework or from a communication perspective. Organizational communication scholars look at these kinds of processes functionally, meaning they want to know how we can control and improve communication to achieve specific goals. They also look at it interpretively to deepen a sense of understanding, that's an important word, of people's needs, experiences, and meaning-making in organizational life. And third, they also study organizational communication, as can you, from a critical perspective. In this lens, we study organizational communication in order to understand the use of power and critique it, especially as it reproduces inequality and other kinds of problems. Matt Kochman of CU Boulder has produced a video that is really useful in explaining this perspective, but is a bit overly long. For that reason, I'm going to attach it at the end of this lecture rather than embed it right here. So look for it, or if you want, pause the video and follow the URL that you see on your screen. Broad areas of interest for organizational communication researchers include professional identity, the uses and abuses of power in organizational life, what work means, that is, what is meaningful work when people do it, as well as the management of tensions and collaboration in relationships. Those very broad topics can be investigated by looking at specific dynamics and cases of these kinds of things: supervision and fellowship, teamwork and boundary spanning, meaning moving across certain kinds of lines or boundaries within and across organizations, trust building and crisis, ethics and corporate social responsibility, and a whole lot more. The hot new stuff is being done in these areas: research on globalization and new contexts. A lot of cases for business and organizational communication research has focused on Europe and the United States. Getting out of North America and Europe can be really useful in looking at and understanding the ways people organize, especially outside of a corporate context. Also, invisibility is of interest to the leading scholars today. What do we do when we try to understand organizing in hidden or clandestine or temporary or alternative or small and ad hoc organizations? We tend to think about organizations in their formal sense. But when we look at organizing, there can be really interesting tensions between formality and informality, visibility and invisibility. And looking at those kinds of questions has really become popular within the last 5 or 6 years. Finally, anything having to do with technology is probably going to end up on a list like this. We're actually very early on in the digitalization of the work world, despite the fact that computers have been around for some time. New technologies and increased communications across different kinds of borders, new ability to share and collaborate in real time, to produce documents and media that are richer than ever, well, those things are changing the way we work. And so, of course, we're going to study the effects on communication and the effects of communication on technologies. Majors and minors in communication studies can end up in careers like this: training and talent development, sales or customer relations, also fundraising, which is a kind of customer or donor relations / sales. We also see students who study organizational communication in public relations and social media management positions. Obviously, human resources, that is, working with the human capital of organizations, and nonprofit management are really viable avenues for this kind of work. Certainly, marketing and business intelligence and research are useful ways in which understanding communication as integral to what it means to be an organization and do organizing, that's a powerful thing in those realms. And finally, all organizations have to have connections to the outside world in terms of bringing people in. Recruitment specialists, headhunters, those kinds of things, they're useful because this is about creating connections between members and folks who are non-members that might become members of the organization. As with many of these kinds of lists, there are a lot more options too. Faculty members do more than just teach your classes or help you decide which courses you might take. Come talk to one of us as an advisor to discuss your career path and the kinds of things that you want to do with your career and your occupations. You'd be surprised the kinds of networks we have and how useful it can be to have someone who can communicate with you non-judgmentally about what you can do to put your communication expertise to work, literally at work. One theory, or perspective in this case, that defines a social construction take on organizing is the communicative constitution of organizations perspective. We'll just call it a theory here. It comes from Robert McPhee, and insert Janis Joplin joke here, from the Arizona State University. The central question that Bob and others ask is, how do people, quote unquote, do organizing and maintain organizations in and through communication? We want to look at what are those specific communicative moves. The practical value here is that we can find strategic opportunities for creating, changing, and working within organizational patterns when we see those patterns themselves, and then we can achieve collective goals because we master particular patterns in context. McPhee's early work on this with co-authors makes central claims about 4 flows of communication that socially construct organization. The claim is that literally these flows of communication are building the thing we call organizations. They use the term flow because they want to talk about the coming and going of messages, the real life of relationships, and so forth, rather than just thinking about a transmission model of organizations being built up from I communicate to you, you respond to me, I communicate with you, and so forth. You get the idea. What are these 4 flows or activities? Number 1 is membership negotiation. This is shaping how we socialize into and relate to others in the organization, as well as to the organization itself. We negotiate what it means to be a member in a variety of ways. Flow number 2 is organizational self-structuring, literally communication about the organization and its processes, to define what the organization is, its formal communication practices, and what its foundational text should say, like, for instance, missions and charters and handbooks and so forth. Beyond that, McPhee says we can look for a third activity, that is activity coordination. This flow is about aligning the goals of different members and crafting systems of cooperation, creating the media, right, through which we can engage one another and work with one another to address problems or uncertainties that are of common concern. Working together is a problem, and it's a problem that communication, the flow of communication, actually helps structure over time within and across organizations. Speaking of across organizations, organizations have relationships to their environments. Fourth and final flow proposed by McPhee's CCO perspective is institutional positioning. This is the crafting of a relationship within the organization's environment, connecting it with quote-unquote outsiders, both individuals and audiences, but also with other organizations like it. We have to identify what's our type of organization and how do we both fit into that type and are distinct from or unique in that particular type of organization. That sort of jockeying for place and broader understanding, that's what we might call institutional positioning. Lin-Hua Rita Men is an organizational communication and public relations scholar, and I've asked you to read some of her work to see an example of research that draws from and contributes to social construction work, communication perspective on organizations. Here are passages from her publication that really show you how she's thinking from a social construction perspective, or really working on communication from the perspective or the paradigms that we've been talking about in this class. In talking about 3 of her major concepts, she says these things. Communication can create satisfying employee-organization relationships, which would not only boost employee productivity, but also help create, do you see the language there about creation and mediation? When discussing the concept of symmetrical communication, she notes that it is a communication worldview and practice. It's a way of thinking as well as a way of behaving, and it's characterized by an emphasis on trust, credibility, openness, and a number of other sort of abstract ideals. So when we communicate, we think about symmetrical communication as an abstract concept that really is brought into a kind of paradigm when it's practiced. So communicating symmetrically requires that we think about communication itself and then negotiate its meaning with others, the people with whom we have a relationship. Third and finally, Men writes that, quote, transformational leadership strongly emphasizes listening, openness, feedback, participation, and relationship, which are key attributes of symmetrical communication patterns. So again, we see things like the management of meaning and the coordinating of actions in the definition of transformational leadership. Let's take those concepts backward one at a time. So first, transformational leadership, then we'll talk about symmetrical communication, and finally, employee satisfaction, and what Men found when she was doing surveys of employees about their preference and the practices of their supervisors when it comes to one-way or two-way symmetrical communication. Transformational leadership is a very common concept in business and organization studies research. It can be defined as a communication style. In particular, transformational leadership is a style that emphasizes people orientation, relationship growth, and higher order motivation of supervisees, employees, colleagues, and so forth. This is as opposed to transactional leadership, right, which is task and management oriented. We focus on the things we're doing in task management or in transactional leadership. But if our style is transformational, the people and the interactions and relationships come into focus. What Men found is that it explained transformational leadership style nearly half of the variance in symmetrical communication. That is, whether or not leaders chose to communicate symmetrically, which we'll define in a second, half of the reasons that they might choose symmetrical communication are due to their transformational leadership style or the absence of it. Supervisors or upper level leaders, transformational leadership explained 45% of the variance in employee satisfaction. So nearly half, 45% of the report of employee satisfaction, well, what she found was that that satisfaction level was influenced to a significant degree by whether or not leaders chose to lead in a transformational versus transactional style. Beyond the fact that transformational leaders tend to prefer face-to-face communication over other forms of mediated communication, they also seem to connect with the practice of symmetrical communication. Symmetrical communication is a worldview and practice that emphasizes two-way feedback, interaction, give and take, as well as things like trust in one another and earning trust if you are higher up in a hierarchy, openness, teamwork, and concepts like this, as opposed to, say, emphasizing hierarchy, emphasizing managed information flow and downward communication. What predicts whether or not a leader is going to utilize a symmetrical communication style? Several of those are whether or not that leader uses transformational leadership, the frequency with which they use or prefer to use face-to-face communication, as well as media like instant messenger that have kind of an immediacy to them, right? Rather than something that's a bit more asynchronous or impersonal or not, IRL, like say email. But among these kinds of things, men found that leaders' decision to use transformational leadership styles, those things significantly affect whether or not the leader will use symmetrical communication styles. But the leader's choice of channel preference, whether they prefer to communicate informally or through things like flyers and posters or big group events or one-on-one, those kinds of choices minimally affected whether or not the leader was likely to use symmetrical communication styles. Overall, then, there's a real interplay between leaders' choices of transactional versus transformational styles, as well as symmetrical versus asymmetrical or one-way communication patterns. But when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, what does that have to do with employees, and in particular, employee levels of satisfaction? The author of this article is a bona fide social scientist, so she wants to get specific. She defines employee satisfaction as the degree to which, so how satisfied we might be, the degree to which parties in a relationship are satisfied with each other. So we're not just talking about other kinds of things about which we might be satisfied. Instead, we're looking at how satisfied are we with the other people with whom we have a relationship at work. Got it? Men says that things that predict how satisfied an employee might be are transformational leadership styles, the use of face-to-face communication, and an organization's communication system that is highly symmetrical. That is, the tendency of organizational communication, message exchange within an organization, to be two-way and interactional as opposed to being up-down and primarily having information flow down from the top to the bottom, so to speak. In the end, we can explain this by saying people who use transformational leadership tend to use symmetrical communication systems, and symmetrical communication systems tend to promote employee satisfaction. In particular, we can say that the use of symmetrical communication will explain, to a degree, why employees in one organization might be more highly satisfied than employees in another organization. One other thing that bared out in this study was that employees and transformational leaders tend to prefer richer forms of interpersonal communication and channel use. By rich, we mean more interactive, more like real-time face-to-face interaction. In particular, Men argues employees and transformational leaders prefer this for interactions between leaders and followers, between supervisors and subordinates. I hope this helps you understand how organizational communication research and theory can help you design more effective and also more humane communication systems in the organizations with which you will work and will engage as both an employee, as a leader, as a customer, and more. At this point then, I'll turn it over to Matt Kochman and his team at CU Boulder. This is a video posted to YouTube that goes into great detail about a social construction perspective or a communicative perspective on organizational communication and organizing. It's a long one and is detailed, so you might want to take a break here if you need to grab yourself some water or attend to any other personal needs. And you can also skip back to the beginning of this presentation, this video, to find that URL that links to YouTube and Matt Kochman's video. Ready or not, here they come.
So what is organizational communication? And what are we doing when we study organizational communication? I want to try and answer these questions from two different perspectives. First, we can talk about organizational communication as the communication that happens within organizations. That is, all the communication activity you'll see if you go to any organization today. Sending emails, writing memos, talking on the phone, having meetings, and more meetings, teleconferencing, video conferencing, speeches, presentations, and so on. This is a more conventional approach, and I think it's what comes to mind when people initially think of organizational communication. But I want to go deeper. I want to introduce an alternative, more sophisticated approach of seeing organizations as communication. This can radically change how we understand human interaction in organizational life, and it opens up exciting new possibilities for research and practice. But first, let's say a bit more about the conventional approach to organizational communication, which focuses on communication within organizations. This perspective sees the organization as something like a container, and communication is what flows within the container. If we extend the metaphor, we can see how communicating is then shaped by the structure of the organization, in the same way that liquids take the shape of their physical containers. And by the shape of the container, we can mean the physical shape of the organization, like if you have to take the elevator up 10 floors to deliver a report to your boss, or more of a symbolic shape, like where you are in the organizational hierarchy and how this influences the way you communicate with other organizational members. The key here is that the organization is seen as something that exists separately from communication. So communication is quote-unquote organizational when it happens within these separate structures we call organizations. This relates to what scholars call an informational view of communication, because communication is all about transmitting information throughout the container of the organization. And quote-unquote ineffective communication or communication breakdowns are seen as technical problems. The right information didn't get to the right people in the right manner. Someone didn't get the memo, as people like to say. And this is important stuff. It's how the work of organizations gets done, from small businesses and multinational corporations to nonprofits and government agencies. If organizations don't communicate the right information to the right people at the right times in the right ways, things fall apart. Directions aren't followed, customers aren't satisfied, clients aren't served, regulations aren't obeyed. General chaos ensues. And in certain high-risk organizations, like our military or your local fire department, getting the right information to the right people is absolutely critical. So, we certainly need effective communication within organizations. But again, I want to go deeper, beyond this conventional view of organizational communication. Because as important as this conventional view is for the day-to-day operations of organizations, I just don't think this view fully captures the complexities of organizing and communicating in our society. In a perfect world, we could create more efficient structures of information sharing so that the right people would always have the right information, and miscommunication would be a thing of the past. But a funny thing happened on the way to communication paradise. Turns out, different people interpret the exact same message very differently. That people can be deceptive in their communication, and their motives are incredibly difficult to figure out. That the meaning of language changes depending upon the context. And that what you don't communicate is often more important than what you do communicate. Or that what you say is often much less important than how you say it. And that people often, if not usually, communicate for many other reasons than to just transmit information. And these are not just aberrations. This is the normal state of affairs for human interaction. Why is it, after all, that quote-unquote communication problems are continually mentioned as one of the main difficulties for most organizations? Is it just that people aren't getting the right information? Well, if so, this is merely a technical problem that should improve as we develop new ways to get better information to more people more efficiently. But it seems like almost the opposite is happening, that the more sophisticated our communication technologies have gotten over the years, the more communication problems we actually have. Now, why is that? Perhaps it's because there is more going on with communication than just transmitting information. So, in contrast to the first approach of communication within organizations, I want to offer an alternative, more sophisticated approach to organizational communication. Organizations as communication. But this means we have to think very differently about both communication and about organizations. Instead of viewing communication as merely the transfer of information, this second approach goes deeper and sees communication as the fundamental process that shapes our social reality. Communication is not just about transmitting already formed data between senders and receivers, but rather a complex process of continually creating and negotiating the meanings and interpretations that shape our lives. Scholars call this a constitutive view of communication, because communication literally constitutes or makes up our social world. More on this later. Additionally, this second approach of seeing organizations as communication questions the very notion of organization in the first place. The first approach of communication in organizations assumes there is this thing called organization that exists, and we just focus on the communication that happens inside. But what exactly is this thing called organization? Where did it come from? Organizations aren't natural. They don't just exist in nature like trees and mountains and rivers. They're created by people, and people have different values and motivations and abilities and resources. So organizations are never just neutral structures that exist apart from human activity. They are the visible manifestations of human activity, of communication. And so at their core, organizations are communicative. Think about it. An organization is essentially an ongoing collection of interactions, decisions, messages, interpretations, symbols, agreements, contracts, relationships, and so forth. There's nothing else there that exists apart from communication. Well, let me qualify that just a bit. Certainly there are other material or physical things there, like buildings, cubicles, computers, and other equipment, and these things help make up the organization. But these things have no inherent meaning apart from human interaction, nor can they have any impact in the real world apart from the choices we make through communication. Similar, the outcomes of communication definitely have consequences in the material world. For example, you might be thinking, hey, if I get laid off, it's not just a matter of perception, it's not just talk. There's a stark reality I have to face. Yes, but how the decision to lay you off was made and the meaning of that decision, whether seen as cost-cutting efficiency or ruthless bottom-line thinking, and how you make sense of this event are all matters of communication. And the accumulation of these communication processes are what make organizations what they are. I'm not suggesting that organizations exist in an imaginary land of perceptions and symbols and wishful thinking, like the material world doesn't matter, it's all in your mind. No. This constitutive perspective of organizations as communication is very much rooted in the material world of things and stuff. But what I am suggesting is that these material things come together and have meaning as an organization only through communication, thus leading us to the conclusion that organizations exist as communication. And my argument is that this second approach, organizations as communication, is a much better perspective to guide our study of organizational communication. Now, of course, we need effective communication within organizations. That's a given. But if we limit ourselves to only this perspective, we miss important opportunities for deeper insights and understanding. But why complicate things with a more sophisticated approach? After all, conventions become conventional for good reason, and conventional views have a lot of practical value. What do we gain with an alternative approach? I'm sure by now there are some objections in favor of the conventional view of communication within organizations I described earlier. After all, the container metaphor seems to describe how most of us actually experience organizational communication much of the time. And the physical reality of organizations, buildings, computers, stuff like that, seem to reinforce the conventional view. So, what's wrong with this approach? Well, when we just focus on communication within organizations, based on that informational view of communication, we're taking what a colleague of mine at the University of Colorado calls a flat earth approach towards communication. What I mean by a flat earth approach is a perspective that seems correct from a limited vantage point because it works for much of our day-to-day lives, but ultimately it fails to account for the complexity of a situation. For much of human history, we got by just fine thinking that the earth was flat, even though it was always round. And even with our 21st century sophistication, where we know the earth is round, most of us can actually get by with flat earth assumptions much of the time. But what about when things get more complex? If you want to put a satellite into space or take a transcontinental flight, flat earth assumptions aren't going to be very helpful. Remember in elementary school when you compared a globe to a map and realized, for example, that it's much quicker to fly from New York to Moscow by flying over the North Pole instead of across the Atlantic? What seems counterintuitive from a flat Earth perspective actually makes perfect sense from a round Earth perspective. And the same is true with communication. We can get by with quote-unquote flat Earth assumptions about communication for much of what we want to do throughout our day. Much of our communication involves sending and receiving relatively unproblematic messages and acting on that information, giving directions, planning our schedules, requesting information, and so on. And the conventional informational approach towards communication works just fine in these situations. But other times things are a bit more complex. Like when you need to resolve conflict with a close friend or family member, or when you have to share bad news with someone you care about, confront someone about a wrongdoing, or you need to mediate a dispute. There's so much more going on in these situations than merely exchanging information. You are actually engaged in a complex process of meaning negotiation and social construction. In these situations, you have to do much more than think about what information you want to exchange. You actually have to think about the social realities you're creating. What might seem intuitive from a conventional flat earth approach to communication, like expressing what you think or trying to control information, may actually work against you because it constitutes a social reality that produces unfavorable outcomes. And this is especially true within the context of organizations. Sure, much of what goes on in organizations is the transmission of messages between senders and receivers. But what about implementing a large-scale organizational change, or navigating the politics of an organization, or persuading skeptical leaders about the merits of a new idea? If you've ever been involved in any of these activities, you know you quickly run up against some organizational complexities that make the mere transmission of information inadequate to successfully accomplishing your goals. Things like power, identity, gender, ideology or worldview, ethnicity, culture, and so forth are the quote-unquote round earth complexities of the organizational landscape that call for a much more sophisticated understanding of communication. And these complexities need to be accounted for if we are to have a good understanding of organizational communication. So this has to do with our approach to communication, either as a thing that happens within organizations or a social process that actually constitutes organizations and organizational realities, and our corresponding approach to organizations, either as relatively neutral containers that exist apart from communication, or as contested sites of power, resources, and strategies that converge into recognizable forms we call organizations. Now, I certainly recognize the importance of the conventional approach to organizational communication, communication within organizations based on an informational view of communication. But I'm trying to push us to a deeper, more sophisticated understanding of organizational communication, organizations as communication based on a constitutive view of communication. The point then is that a constitutive view of organizations as communication enables us to question and investigate key organizational realities, not just accept them as given. We can question the existence of the organization, its structure, its forms of power, its guiding assumptions, its norms of operations, and so on. If these organizational features are not natural, but rather came into existence through specific communication processes, then we can examine the implications of those communication processes and explore ways of communicating that lead to more favorable organizational outcomes for more people. We can examine, for example, how certain patterns of interaction give rise to norms of conflict resolution, or how the taken for granted values of a particular industry or sector shape the practice of leadership, or how interpersonal dynamics affect the success of an organizational change initiative. We can look at how certain views of masculinity or femininity are connected to communication practices, or how our very identities are often created and sustained through organizational communication. We can uncover hidden forms of power and control that are embedded within communication processes. We can explore ways to make organizations more equitable and representative by surfacing alternative voices. We can figure out how to make organizations more productive, adaptive, and responsive through organizational communication that encourages innovation and collaboration. Whatever the case, a constitutive view of organizations as communication provides a much stronger explanatory framework to understand the complexities of organizing and communicating. What I'm advocating, therefore, is a communicative approach to our understanding of organizations. Organizational communication is all about taking a communication perspective to the study of organizations, exploring organizations through the lens of communication. Communication is not the thing to be explained. Communication actually provides an explanatory framework from which to understand the complexities of organizational life. Of course, our natural tendency is to relapse back to the conventional view, the container metaphor, communication within organizations, because it seems simple and intuitive from a limited perspective. But I'm trying to push us towards a deeper understanding, a perspective that better accounts for the complexities of organizing and human interaction. So what is organizational communication, and what are we doing when we study organizational communication? Communication is quote-unquote organizational, not just because it happens within organizations, but rather because it coordinates the activities and interpretations of multiple people into an organized, recognizable form and sustains or alters this form for subsequent collective action. To study organizational communication, therefore, is to study the fundamental social processes that create and sustain the dominant structures of our society.